We are after a difficult week where Venezuela once again had to fight for its democracy, but had different diplomatic wins at the OAS and the United Nations. How did this take place under a global polarization, difficult to hold the presidency of someone that no one elects, but no one knows about who is, and no one can even pronounce his last name? A member of the opposition who has run from the Justice, Antonio Ledesma, mentioned some keywords to AP. Weeks of diplomacy allowed the coordination and consolidation of the strategy. Previously, Guaido had traveled to the States, Colombia, and Brazil with the support of Iván Duque in order to avoid raising awareness by the migratory authorities of Venezuela. What's next? What's the narrative we're going to hear right now? Is there anything seen before in international law that wants to be used today? Multilateral organizations, maybe they're instrumental for the interest of Washington? Governments that don't come after election. How do they demand elections in Venezuela after an electoral process with a system acknowledged one of the most transparent in the world? How determining this could be geopolitically for the break of relationship between the U.S. and Venezuela. Venezuela, through the Security Council of the UN, shows the fight in the global arena. This is Critical Moves today. Let's take a look at the factors and the actors that are involved. Stay with us. On Saturday, January 26, on the request of American authorities, the Security Council of the United Nations had a session to tackle in extraordinary fashion the political situation of Venezuela. The interventions are divided into two sides, the one that took place during the Saturday. For and against Venezuela, Secretary of State of the State Mike Pompeo had a threatening speech. It was similar to the Cold War, according to Jorge Raza. Then Pompeo left. The Chancellor of Venezuela was emphatic by saying that the states are ahead of the coup, with the allies of the European Union that have set an ultimatum to the government of Nicolas Maduro with any type of legal basis. Now we have a new leader, Juan Guaido, in Venezuela, who has promised to call elections and bring back security to Venezuela as well as the constitutional order. We cannot delay these critical talks that bring attention of the world for the good of Venezuela and the region. We must support Venezuelans, and we must do it right now. Where does it come a power such as yours to say that you can set an ultimatum to a government? Where in your mind can you think that this type of action, this type of childish action can take place? Why isn't Pedro Sanchez calling elections? Who elect Pedro Sanchez? Carry out elections in the United Kingdom, dare to do so. Why President Macron, instead of listening to the permanent protest of the yellow vests of the working class of France, is trying to attack Venezuela, specifically the countries of the Caribbean? Those who spoke about not taking place in the events of the state and to respect the sovereignty of independent states. These are states that are not members of the Security Council. This confirms what I mentioned when Mike Pompeo was in the room. The world is not what he thinks it is. The majority of the members voted yes for the legitimate government and also against internal interference. The United States has not achieved its objectives. The objective that has been set has not been achieved. So why calling these sessions? It was useful because it demonstrating our American colleagues how far or what the international community thinks about the situation in Venezuela. We hope to say once again, we don't need to create fire over the tensions in Venezuela. Stop threatening us with the use of force against the country. And that absurd 8-day ultimatum. Why 8? Why not 7 or 3? Where did you get this number from? Where is this formula coming from? Allow Venezuelans to solve the problems they have by themselves. If you can help, do it. But don't try to get where you don't belong. Let's hope that Mexico follows what they have decided between the government and the opposition. And we urge everyone to join their efforts with good intentions. So, 19 out of 36 countries rejected this. And they voted for dialogue and respect to the Constitution. Based on these results, we consider this a new diplomatic triumph that was presided due to the meeting in order to approve a resolution against Venezuela. This was the correlation of forces on Saturday. Voting for non-interference of the empire voted Venezuela, Russia, South Africa, Equatorial Guinea, Kuwait, China, Indonesia, Cote d'Ivoire, Nicaragua, Cuba, St. Vincent Grenadines, Bolivia, Suriname, Mexico, Barbados, Uruguay, El Salvador, Dominica, and Antigua and Barbuda. That diplomatic representatives of these countries mentioned that this debate should have never been opened in the Security Council because it's a matter exclusively related to the internal affairs of Venezuela. Against voted the United States, the United Kingdom, Peru, France, Germany, Poland, Belgium, Colombia, Canada, Paraguay, Argentina, Ecuador, Chile, Brazil, Costa Rica, Honduras, and Panama. And it is considered that the Dominican Republic, country presiding the Security Council this month, based on the monthly rotation of this instance, set an ambiguous perspective. Well, so this is how things are, as clear as it can be. Now let's take a look at what was published by Misión Verdad, independent journalists dedicated to study the war against Venezuela and the global conflict. The title they proposed is, "Who is in charge of restoring democracy in Venezuela?" This is Elliot Abrams, who was appointed by the White House to restore democracy. He had different functions during Ronald Reagan's term in the wars, was an advisor during the administration of George W. Bush, together with John Bolton, John de Ponte, and Roger Noriega, as well as others. He is responsible for thousands and thousands of dead people due to the wars in Central America. He tried to recover the war spirit of the States with actions that took place in his backyard, Latin America, with a perspective of undercover operations during the 1980s. This also was mentioned by Misión Verdad's portal. Now, our recommendation can be found in Hispan TV. Title is as follows: Venezuela and the attack of hypocrites and those wanting to create a coup. Written by Pablo Hofer from Chile, international analyst, and master in foreign affairs by the Complutense University of Madrid, and says as follows in one of the parts of his article: Venezuela is fighting an epic battle. What doubts may we have? A fight against the great powers of imperialism and their acolytes that day by day attack against it and try to make it fall down in the economic stage, and creating the possibility of real attacks with no flags. By Tades and with other statements that also show the hypocrisy of those who are arrogant and wants to fight when it's about Venezuela. but don't say a word when it's about those who really violate international law, international human rights of millions of human beings, war criminals, and also those that have carried out crimes against humanity as the Zionists and the Saudi monarchy. This is mentioned by Pablo in his last article about Venezuela. The geopolitical reading of this has been followed with a special attention. In the Security Council, Alina Duarte was attending, and who better than her, our correspondent, to provide more details, more information, and specifically, Alina, to listen about what people have to say in their states, if any. Hello, Lucia. How are you? Well, these are specifically events have taken place. We're on Saturday in the session of the Security Council, where we heard about these two completely clear perspectives. First, the respect of sovereignty, the right of self-determination, non-intervention, and the other one led by the states in order to intervene in internal matters of Venezuela. Nevertheless, even though the states had tried to set all this narrative of hegemony, stating that Venezuela was isolated during the last days mainly, with overwhelming support for the so-called parallel government the states are orchestrating in Venezuela. What undercovered the Security Council that was celebrated by the Bolivarian nation was specifically breaking this narrative of hegemony of the isolation of Venezuela. Also, we have these perspectives from Mexico and Uruguay calling for this dialogue to intercede, and specifically we need to mention that without violating the state of law of Venezuela, because many have said that this dialogue that is suggested by Mexico and Uruguay could also be a flagrant violation of the sovereignty of Venezuela. Well, they emphasized that this dialogue was going to be carried out without any type of violation of the state of law. And many others who did not have enough with the intervention of Venezuela were those who provided this ultimatum. We also heard the statements of the Chancellor, who said if they really had the option, the European nations, they don't even go to elections to choose the representatives. So this was taking place. But it also calls our attention that even the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, the Chancellor of the United States, left the room after his participation and decided not to listen the other delegations. So we also need to hear he had no possibility to vote for any resolution, because in order to vote for any of this, he needed to have 5 votes of the permanent members. So he needed to have votes of Russia and China that they did not have. That's why the United States did not have the possibility to operate under a given margin. They did not speak about economic sanctions, and this is something that many countries also mentioned. As of today, the United States, we heard Mike Pompeo saying the days before in front of the OAS, suggesting that they are going to donate $20 million in humanitarian support to Venezuela. However, the blockade and the economic sanctions that have been imposed during the last few months have cost $26 billion. So it just cannot be compared, the amount of money that they want to give right now about humanitarian support, with the fact that $26 billion are worth of sanctions so far, while the United States only want to provide humanitarian support up to $20 million. This was set on the table, and it calls the attention of the people, the maneuvers of the state, when they speak with Elliot Arms, who's someone as infamous as he is, together with the rest of the statements of different members of the White House who have tried to legitimate what's happening in Venezuela. We've listened and read Twitter accounts of Mike Pence calling the international community, trying to pressure it, and also Mike Pompeo mentioned that this last play in Australia that also was speaking about the public government was due to the pressure set by Mike Pompeo personally. So all the members of the White House continue operating and orchestrating this coup that, at least publicly, has been dismantling, but it's still taking the governor states under despair to continue with it. Thank you, Alina, once again for the information about the event that have taken place during last week. So important geopolitical terms. That was Alina from Washington, D.C. We also had that very important information. Was it possible to continue with the resolution against Venezuela? Well, Russia and China are two permanent members that clearly have spoken for dialogue in order to keep the constitutional threat in the South American nation. Jorge Arreaza, the chancellor, emphatically mentioned, and with the Charter of the State, how curious it is that those behind the unilateral restrictions against Venezuela claim today for its stability and peace, for its democracy, and now there is flags of freedom. Well, this was followed closely in Venezuelan territory. It was also a week of demonstration and government activities. So how are the streets during the beginning of the week in Venezuela? Malen Garcia from Caracas is going to tell us about this. It's great having you. How are you? Hello, Lucia. How are you? Well, streets in Venezuela today are calm. Social networks have mentioned that there are demonstrations today, that there's a massacre taking place here, and have created this matrix of opinion. But today, there was a patriotic march, an administrative march of the 5 branches of the Bolivarian Armed Forces in Fuerte Tiuna, the biggest military fort of this country. And it was headed by the Ministry of Defense with the military command and the soldiers of all the different parts of the armed forces. So what was it for? Well, it's part of the military exercises, Lucia, based on what's going to happen on 10 and 15 of February, when Venezuela commemorates 200 years of the Charter or the Congress of Angostura in the state of Bolivar. This is timely when the Minister of Defense said, here we are, the soldiers of the nation, to defend Venezuela, to defend it from the interest, from the interference, and requested the Venezuelan soldiers not to pay attention, for no one to hear to the words from abroad, that the voices will not disturb or confuse. This is a time of fight, and they are ready to fight for it. The Minister of Defense also said to the countries that have acknowledged the self-proclaimed Juan Guaidó that there's a single president in the country, Nicolas Maduro Moros, who's also the commander-in-chief of the Bolivarian Armed Force, and that those intentions of the opposition of Venezuela of calling the military to become part of this coup will not achieve so, because the military follow the Constitution. They follow democracy. The people spoke on May 20th, and that's why the military will defend this country, and added, with the presence of military of Israel and Brazil, they said that they were following the same script of Libya. This was warned by him, that these steps have been taking place, and that even mercenaries could come to Colombia. But he said, here we have the armed forces to fight them. We are prepared. Lucia, this is a very important moment in Venezuela, because this is not only about the coup that has been imposed by the United States, where they have named a president that wasn't elected by anyone. Juan Guaidó is a congressman of the National Assembly of this country who had 90,000 votes. Nicolas Maduro is the president who participated as a candidate on May 20th in open, free elections where over 200 international observers participated and won with 6 million votes. And in a single move, Juan Guaidó now believes himself to be the interim president of the country. They call him interim, but this is not part of the constitution. It's not contemplated in Venezuela's constitution. And they call Maduro the one who has stolen the functions of the country, but it's not part of the constitution because they deny that those elections have taken place in May. This election, Lucia, we must mention, where they did not want to participate. They even called people to stop voting, sabotaging a different sector of the opposition of Venezuela that decided to participate and that voted, where Nicolas Maduro won with over 67% of the votes against these candidates, three candidates of the opposition who lost against the option of Nicolas Maduro. So the streets today in Venezuela are calm. They wanted to create chaos starting on the 22nd, because the 22nd or 23rd, Juan Guaidó proclaimed himself as the interim president of the country. But violence was controlled by the different forces, and intelligence mentioned that these demonstrations were led by criminals who were apprehended and were able to neutralize them. But everything was set to create a massacre and to have Venezuelans killed in front of the Security Council of the United Nations, and they were unable to do so, so now they call it a massacre. So these are things have taken place. The Chancellor has already mentioned there's a commission of the state of the United Nations there to speak with the Secretary of the United Nations, with Antonio Guterres, and also there's a group of countries that are doing everything in their hands to continue with this diplomatic effort. They are trying to avoid a situation in Venezuela. And also Jorge Arreaza requested the United States to stop saying those schizophrenic statements in order to stabilize the relationship with Venezuela. This is the state of events. Thank you, Madeleine. So we know what's happening. The streets are calm and everything is happening normally in our country. It's important to take a look at the international events, the United Nations, and what took place in the Security Council. Maybe this sets a precedent. Maybe a way to stop the strategy of destabilizing Venezuela, or maybe the United States will decide or will use the strategy and continue with new formats of intervention in this nation. In geopolitical terms, what Venezuela means and what a breakage between these two countries would entail for the countries of our America. We'll be back, and when we come back, we will listen to our invitees. We're back with critical moves today. Venezuela and the Security Council of the United Nations, a portrait of the global portal. Let's take a look at Hispan TV Nexo Latino's article. It is important for us, the role of the States in coup d'etats. And here we have some information from the digital team of this portal that shows the chronology that demonstrates, and it shows how the states and its governments have orchestrated coup d'etats through the contemporary history. This is a region that they consider their backyard, of course, Latin America. And with this information, we can see military coups with direct interventions that have taken democratic governments out of power. Those were elected by popular votes, while they also led to years of dictatorships in the region and killed an incredible number of people. So there were numbers for Argentina, hundreds of dead people with no identity because they were taken away from the hands of their parents and sold in the apprehension centers by the military. Guatemala 1954, Honduras, Panama, Chile, Cuba 1952, Haiti, Grenada, Venezuela 2002, Brazil, as well as the case of Argentina. Now, I'm going to take a look at Prensa Latina that provides us with the next information. The president of Venezuela speaks about the loyalty of the armed forces. Malen Garcia spoke about this. This was part of the news during the weekend. Military exercises in the north center of the region as the preparation of what's going to happen in Bolivar due to the bicentenary of the Angostura speech by the liberator Simon Bolivar. And this preparation also showed the communication possibility that the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela has. It was a presidential order that not only ratified the president once again, but also demonstrated the loyalty of the armed forces. Now, I will switch the portal and going to read the next thing. And we need to gather some data of the events that have taken place, as well as also bring our analysts when needed. After in 2017, where there was an episode of extreme violence for 3 consecutive months of the actions that took place in the streets in specific sectors of Venezuela that left dozens of people killed and wounded, the Constituent Assembly was called and it was installed later. Then there was a process of national dialogue between delegations of both parts with the headquarters in the Dominican Republic with international accompaniment, including the Vatican. So what happened after? Let's remember the events and then we'll continue with our analysis. After many discussions about to sign an agreement, the right wing decided not to sign, and only executive did. One of the points was to have elections in May 2018. Even though the opposition said no, the other party of opposition decided to also take part, and the government the same. So on May 20th, Nicolas Maduro, president, was ratified for over 6 million people. These elections were demanded by the opposition, even as a condition, but from one moment to the other, they decided there were no minimum warranties to carry them out, even though arbitration logistics were in charge of the CNE that had elections where the right wing won in 2015. The argument was the lack of possibility of trusting the organization. The state and the European Union held more sanctions against Venezuela. In the midst of all this and the agenda of war, Nicolas Maduro was sworn in for his second constitutional term. With over 90 delegations and spokespeople of different multilateral organizations as OPEC, on January 23, the polarized agendas took place again. Chavism once again spoke about the threat of the empire, but mentioning that they were going to follow sovereignty, and there were the so-called cabildos in the streets, and Juan Guaidó self-proclaimed himself as the interim president of Venezuela. Beyond the political ordering of the country, Mike Pompeo previously had requested this publicly. The government of Maduro decided to break relationships with the state and request its diplomats to abandon the country in 72 hours' time for their interference with internal affairs matters. Now, let's bring in our analyst. Here we have Surendra Sinejik. I hope that I'm mentioning your name correctly. Professor of Specialization in Latin America, and David Gomez Ramirez, a writer of Venezuela, living abroad for some months. I would like to ask Surendra. The debate in the United Nations Saturday was a postcard of what's happening in the world, a portrait of how global ordering is being seen. Surendra, what do you think about this? Good afternoon, and thank you very much for the invitation to participate in this debate in Critical Moves. Well, let's start by saying that the meeting of the OAS and then what took place in the meeting of the United Nations too. The government of the States failed twice. I think that the European Union is the third and only option that the states have left to continue exercising pressure on the constitutional illegitimate on the legitimate government of Nicolas Maduro. Due to the position taken by important countries such as Russia, China, Turkey, Cuba, and others. Now, let's continue with David Gomez Rodriguez. Thank you, Studenta. We will continue with you in a second. Now, let's listen to David in Moscow. David, what's the result? The world is listening to a development. We need to see Venezuela as the fundamental piece in plurality. I'm asking because we also need to learn what's the political role that the country is playing. Hello, everyone in Telesur. Now we're seeing once again how the world is divided in the midst of certain proposals that attempt to go against history, against the fight of the people, of the whole humanity, the whole world. Venezuela today is the core of a global debate where we take the position of defending sovereignty, where we have at stake international law. We see how the position of imperial countries and satellite countries to the American empire have taken, unfortunately, a position of not respecting the self-determination of the people. Venezuela, once again, is raising a flag of hope and the open possibility, an open window and door to a multipolar world where all the countries will have the possibility of holding a relationship of respect, solidarity, integration, cooperation that will lead to understanding and dialogue in order to progress regardless of the differences in ideology. The bold position of the States that today is ahead of coup d'etat, and with the president having similar events taking place throughout the history of Latin America in the 21st century, as well as the beginning of the 21st century, is what needs to be vindicated in Venezuela. The people today is who, together with the government and the mechanisms for peace that we have been building through the Bolivarian diplomacy, those who will be victorious in this fight, as we have seen throughout the spaces of discussion and dialogue, of discussion of the real meaning of the future of the world as the Security Council of the United Nations. We've seen the defeat of the American imperialism. We've seen the defeat at the main stage of the irrational positions of going against a country that has spoken about freedom and sovereignty, and a political project guided to Bolivarian socialism of the 21st century. And we've seen the dirty parts of imperialism and the lucky countries to it that have tried to violate the most sacred thing that a country may have, its sovereignty. Now, I would like to ask Surendra about the role of Russia and China. What are these interventions demonstrating? You mentioned something in your first reply, but I would like to listen to you. Have we ever seen before such a strong support for Venezuela? Because as we can see that they are trying to take back the Monroe Doctrine, but the geopolitical context of the 80s is completely different to the one that we have today, mainly because China and Russia are gaining more space in the world, but also Venezuela is perfectly tuned with them. So what has this meant in geopolitical terms? What's your reading on this, Surendra? I personally believe that this debate that just has recently started about the return of the Cold War in Latin America in the 21st century is a very important debate, not only for the countries of Latin America, but overall to geopolitics around the world. We have seen what the government of the United States did in the 60s, 70s, and 80s in all these countries of Latin America, starting with Guatemala and up to Chile in 1973. So those who make the best of history are the better students around the world. This is what we have learned. Both the far right of Venezuela as the far left that are governing in other countries of Latin America currently need to understand what happened during the 20th century in all these countries. They could be mistaken right now by thinking that at the short term, this is going to bring them a benefit. This position that they're having today, becoming allies of the government of the United States. But from the 20th century, we've gathered different lessons, and this is what they also need to read and study. If they don't do it right now, it will be a big mistake once again, a historical mistake that will have historical precedents. Surendra and David, thank you very much. Thank you for connecting with us today from India and Russia. Well, there's a core point that might justify this attack, which is the need of taking appropriation of different natural resources over which the Republic of Venezuela lays in the diverse and privileged geography that it holds. Let's go to a break and bring back key points about this. So we will continue with the next analysis after the break. Venezuela at the Security Council of the United Nations. Today, this is what we have in Critical Moves. We wonder what's the real interest in this South American nation. Well, of course, it's the country with the greatest oil reserves in the world, and maybe this could be a key element. The main actions of a parallel and legitimate document, as mentioned in the last document, mentions that they are trying to favor American companies trying to exploit oil from Venezuela, but also want to come back under the conditions that were before the Bolivarian Revolution. So they had extraordinary income because they paid the state a very small amount of money while disrespecting national sovereignty. A note published by ASP Global Plus mentions that as part of the plans of Guaido is to renew Cisco Petroleum Combination with operational capacity of 750,000 barrels a day, 4% of the total amount refined in the States. Also, Director of the Security Council of the United States, John Bolton, mentioned that the funds and assets blocked to Venezuela should be managed by Juan Guaido, interim president of the country. Guaido also wants to create a new law for hydrocarbons with other topics for investment, and also speaks about the creation of a new agenda of hydrocarbons to offer rounds for procurement of heavy and extra heavy oil, and of data to conclude that the line will be to revert the process of nationalization concluded by the Bolivarian Assembly in its beginning in order to regain the sovereign administration of the resources on its ground through a new regimen of exploitation that helps transnationals, and not only their states have entered the hydrocarbon stake. In the case of the European Union, there are other investors, and he also speaks about gas and oil in the country. Shell also has agreements with PDVSA for $28 billion, and Repsol is present in blocks of production in the country. In order to continue with this, we have Francisco Artigas, lawyer expert in constitutional law. It's a pleasure having you here, Francisco. Thank you for being with us. Thank you for the invitation, Lucia. Welcome, and I would like to ask you a question about this. Is this about oil? Is this about the reserves that we have in our ground as Venezuela? This is also a part of refounding the Republic and the new concept included in the Constitution. Indeed, evidently, all the struggles and all the wars, the attacks that the United States have set against other countries are perfectly related to geostrategic interests of the United States of America and, above all, related to their need of energy of their people in their country in order to keep their lifestyle. Oil, as we perfectly know, is the most important source of energy of the 21st and 20th century, and the United States are not willing to give back the hegemony and domination they have over oil. As an example, we can mention Syria and Libya that have been countries attacked under the context of domination of energy throughout the world. So they are basically trying to go against Venezuela's decision of working with their own resources. Yes, but beyond that, they are trying to rescue the absolute domination that they had on Venezuelan oil. We know perfectly that Venezuela has over 312,000 million barrels of oil of tested reserves with 40% recovery cost, which tends to increase the reserves at the same time that technologies are able to retrieve this money. And there are clear studies that demonstrate that these technologies have been overcome, and thus, beyond being the biggest reserve of oil of the world, now we have the possibility of doubling these reserves, by which we will be taking over the global sphere about oil. Transnational companies, their capital is determined by the amount of oil reserves that they have in their possession, and these reserves are trying to rescue or to take over this international reserve held in Venezuela. What are the other reasons under which all this strategy is deployed of trying to dismember Venezuela? This looks like a systematic purpose invariable throughout the timeline when we try to understand the strategic policy set forth by the United States. What other reasons do the United States have and their allies for this? Well, here, there's an evident strategy of domination of South America. Venezuela, due to its geostrategic location, it's vitally important for the domination of the South, the Caribbean, that is wealthy in natural resources and biodiversity. It's also an area for maritime and aerial transport that provide accessibility to all different sectors of America and Europe, and thus control of the Caribbean would provide a position of privilege to whoever has this control. Of course, the intervention in Venezuela would also mean to close the basin of the Caribbean to countries as China that have reached this region to get relationships under different conditions with these countries. Do you see it as this? Yes, of course, I see it as such. They pretend, beyond closing the doors to China, they want to keep hegemony in the domination of these areas. Nevertheless, in Venezuela, there's an important number of other strategic resources as coltan, as gold, and other products, natural products, that are vitally important to keep the high demand of the lifestyle of the North American people and Europeans too. Here, it is clear why countries of Latin America, with interesting far from defending their brothers and their own countries, they've tried to get some money from these riches. Now, Venezuela is unwounded from this new format, from this attempt of creating a para-government, to call it somehow, a parallel legitimate government with the direct participation of the state in this coup d'etat. Yes, so far we've dominated all the strategies of the Empire of the North. They've tried to use the OAS as a forum to attempt to put sanctions against us and acknowledge the parallel government that the states are trying to set through the congressmen of the National Assembly. And after the defeat they saw at the OAS, where they were victorious just days before, now they are trying to run to the Security Council of the United Nations, where they were also defeated after the first service of the opinions of the country's member of the United Nations and some guests that shared their immediate opinion and immediately tried to withhold this request of inclusion under the agenda of the Security Council, which is something that had a generalized opinion, meaning that it's an interference in Venezuelan affairs, as the duty of the countries of respecting self-determination of the peoples. Now, let me ask you, what do you think will continue with the agenda? On Saturday, an analyst, while we were covering the events of the Security Council, Francisco Luane, maybe what has taken place there could be a breaking point, because it could become a wall for their states. Will they be able to continue, or what will they do? Listen, Venezuela has a lot of resources. It's the president of one country, is part of the presidency of the OPEC. These are resources of international diplomacy that can be used together with this contention that took place in the Security Council. However, there's an important precedent, sir, before that cannot be left behind, where going to the Security Council was one of the strategies used by the states when attacking Libya, and that later, when they saw their proposal not approved, expressed that the legitimate defense was going to be the justification for an attack. So we are not certain about what's the intention of the states when trying to call on the Security Council, trying to make this as legal, even though they have violated all international laws. So of course they didn't get it. Yes, they did not get it because it was not part of the agenda. They wanted to include it. It was nothing but a debate. That's why the defeat that Venezuela gave them and the rest of the democratic countries of the world have also said, by stating that a situation of recognizing a president eliminates a paradigm, which is the paradigm of democracy that they have tried to sell us as a paradigm of democracy of the West. by eliminating electoral processes as a way of electing a president, then they would be eliminating this paradigm of democracy, and they would have to create another through the consensus of a group of countries where they choose the president of a different country. So we'll have to see this under the new context of the Venezuelan crisis and within the political vision internationally and as part of the diplomatic sphere that we are checking today. Thank you, Francisco. I'm writing down these ideas to add them to our conclusions. So we'll see you the next time. Thank you, Lucia. No, thank you, Francisco. So now let's take a look at our conclusions. Transcendental moments we're going through. A polarized world, running out of the scheme of unipolar relationships, an emerging pluripolar world. This is what we've seen on Saturday in the Congress of the Security Council of the United Nations. Venezuela, with its reserve of gold, oil, and coltan, and never associated to war, is still resisting. It fulfills it's necessary to maneuver for the Constitution and certain specific parts of public law internationally. There are powers outside of the country that want to dismember our country and gather the assets that we have, resources that are essential assets for all the political and financial web of the United States. The strategic objective is also that the Republic of Venezuela, under the context of this new world where China and Russia are stopping the forces of duress of the United Nations and the United States as well. Venezuela is perfectly tuned under this new system of the world. So will they definitely displace the new centers of powers? What's the roadmap to follow? This is yet to be seen. This is how we close Critical Moves today. Thank you for being with us in this geopolitical space of Telesur Critical Moves. See you tomorrow at 12:30 Caracas, Venezuela.